Hey guys, Will here. So believe it or not, it's been pretty much exactly a year since we first took a look at the Simagic Alpha EVO lineup, including the Sport at 9 Newton meters, the Standard at 12 Newton meters, and of course the Pro at 18 Newton meters of strength. Now, those of you who are familiar with our direct drive buyer's guide over on boostedmedia.net would have seen that we've had those three models rated at the very top of our value for money scale in the time since. So when Simagic announced that they were going to be releasing a 28 Newton meter Ultra model, of course, we had a lot of questions, and those questions are what we're going to be aiming to answer in today's video. So without further ado, let's take a look at what the Simagic EVO Ultra is all about. So lots to get through today, but firstly, as always, a couple of quick housekeeping things just so you have the full context of exactly what we are doing here today. So firstly, thank you to Simagic for sending across these products for us to check out. Now, one of the things that we love to do here at Boosted Media is to cross-compare products against other brands as well to help you guys make the best possible decision for your particular needs and budget. So it's important that you're aware that all the products that we'll be discussing today and all the other products that you'll find in comparison charts on our website as well were all provided to us under the exact same conditions, and no third party has any sort of input whatsoever into anything that we'll be discussing today. Everything you'll be hearing from me today is just purely mine and Tom's observations from our own testing. So just wanted to make sure that you guys were 100% clear on that. Now, if you are in the market for a new wheelbase or any other sim racing gear for that matter, do yourself a favor, head over to boostedmedia.net. There you'll find a whole bunch of comparison charts, buyer's guides, a list of discount codes as well for Boosted Media viewers. And there's also a brand new partner reseller network on the website as well, which is an easy way to find a local dealer that we're happy to recommend based off our own experience and we're dealing with them ourselves. So hopefully that helps you guys out. But yeah, the idea there is that regardless of what sim racing gear you might want to be after, it's a convenient way for you to help support our work here at Boosted Media without it costing you an extra cent. And that's what keeps the wheels turning here. So we really appreciate your support in that way. So before we dive into pricing information, just want to quickly touch on compatibility here. So out of the box, all Simagic products are only PC compatible. Now there are third-party adapters like the Sigma Cortex, for example, which do, at least to a certain extent, unlock console compatibility. One thing that it is really important to be aware of there, though, is that unlike other brands like LOGITECH, Fanatec, Thrustmaster, and so forth, which have native licensed compatibility with consoles, it is an unlicensed system. So that means that theoretically, there could be a software update for PlayStation or Xbox that could potentially break that compatibility. So just something to keep in your mind if you are looking at investing in a sim racing setup specifically for console. There's no guarantee like you get with a officially licensed product that they would work into the future. So yeah, just be mindful of that. But now you understand that, let's talk about some pricing information. So at the time of filming, Simagic have this guy listed on their website at $969 US. Obviously just make sure that you account for local shipping costs, import duties, tariffs, and things like that, depending on where you are in the world. And if you head down to the description box, you'll find a link through to our written review, which goes into a lot more detail around pricing breakdowns, some other pricing from other resellers around the world, comparisons against other products, and so forth. But just to give you a super quick comparison here, just within the EVO range, the EVO Sport at 9 Newton meters comes in at $399 at the time of filming, in US dollars that is. The standard EVO 12 Newton meter is $519 US, and the EVO Pro at 18 Newton meters comes in at $699 US. So it is quite a jump up to the EVO Ultra from that EVO Pro, especially considering that, in my opinion at least, that EVO Pro is more than likely enough for pretty much anybody out there. So what exactly are you getting with the EVO Ultra? Why might you be compelled to look at this instead of the EVO Pro or potentially upgrading to the Ultra? So let's go through the hardware and specs in some more detail now. So as I've said a couple of times now, you're looking at 28 Newton meters of peak strength with the EVO Ultra. Now you guys have heard me say many times that I think the sweet spot for the majority of people is going to sit somewhere between about the sort of 12 to 14, maybe 16 Newton meters of peak strength, depending on how much headroom that you want to have for things like clipping. So already you can kind of see where I'm going with this. The Pro already sits above that. So you're looking at a massive 10 Newton meter increase there in terms of dynamic range. So other than that, in terms of the raw specifications on paper, it is very similar to the other models within the EVO range. So it uses the same 21-bit encoder and so forth, same inputs and outputs on the back of the units as well. So they do have the ability to have USB pass-through, as we'll look at a little bit later on. You've got multiple inputs for accessories and so forth. Now, because all that is exactly the same as the other EVO models, I'm not going to waste your time today making you go through all that with me again. If you're not sure what that's all about, I'll link the the original Evo video down below for you guys so you can bring yourselves up to speed. So increase in dynamic range aside, the main thing that Simagic have been pushing through their marketing has been the design of this guy here. Now, if you're technically minded, you probably already know what this is, but if you've got no idea, that's okay. This is the motor shaft. So I'm not going to go into heavy tech here, but basically you've got a series of magnets around here. This is a 5-pole motor. So we've got a series of magnets around here that interact with the magnetic field. And basically this creates the center part of the motor that rotates. You've got an outer casing, and the electromagnetic forces between the two are what create the rotation. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this is because the weight of this is actually fundamentally important to the raw performance of the motor. Now, you guys might have heard me say before, but if you haven't, I'll explain it again. The larger you go with an electric motor, the more inertia, the more weight it's going to have in its moving parts. And this is what's known as a rotating mass. So when this is rotating at high speed, to change direction or to stop that rotation, you're going to be fighting against the rotating mass's own inertia. The heavier this is, the more force it's going to require to stop it or change directions, in simple terms. So the design of this is actually fundamentally important. What that means in terms of the raw driving experience is that big, powerful, heavy motors often need to be running towards the upper end of their dynamic range to actually feel any good. You guys have seen it in a couple of reviews. You might have a super powerful wheelbase, but then when you try to run it at a realistic strength level, it actually feels quite sloppy, simply because the motor effectively has an efficiency range, and the lower you go, the further outside that efficiency range you're running. So being able to produce a high-powered motor that still has a relatively lightweight shaft kind of unlocks the best of both worlds there. So in terms of the driving experience, and you'll hear me talk about this later on, one of the things that really stood out about this wheelbase is that regardless of whereabouts you have it adjusted in terms of overall dynamic range, it still provides a very responsive driving experience. So even if you want to run it down as far as, say, like 8 Newton meters of strength, it doesn't just go dead in your hands like a lot of other wheelbases do. So that's the reason why you guys have heard me say many times, if you know that you're not going to need more than, say, 9, maybe 12 Newton meters of strength, in most cases, you're actually better off going for a wheelbase that provides that level of strength rather than going for something that shoots way past that and then running it at a fraction of its overall capability. So it can be quite confusing because you hear a lot of people talking about having additional headroom in your dynamic range as well. And that is important to a point, but there is going to be some point on the scale, and it's going to be a little bit different for everybody, where the additional headroom is just no longer necessary and you'd actually be better off going in another direction. So we weighed this guy ourselves and it came in at 2.25 kilograms. And just to give you a point of reference, now obviously this isn't representative of every other product on the market, but this is the shaft out of an original Moza R16. And you can see it looks a lot bigger and bulkier, and there are, whoa, that was my finger. Yeah. And I don't want to turn this into a shaft measuring contest, but the point I'm trying to make here is that you can see this is quite a bit larger, bulkier, and this guy weighs a touch over 2.5 kilograms if you subtract the weight of the bearing on the nose here, because we don't have a bearing on this sample piece just here. So that's quite a bit of additional rotating mass, considering that this is off a 16 Newton meter wheelbase and you're looking at a 28 Newton meter wheelbase with a lighter shaft in this case. So I don't have the weights and I don't have samples of every single shaft here to show you guys, unfortunately, but hopefully that gives you a better understanding of what's actually going on behind the scenes here, why it's important, and how it translates into what you feel in your hands when you're driving around the track, which is of course the most important thing. But other than that, everything else is pretty much the same. You've got the same side mounting points, you've got the same bottom mounting points as well, the Fanatec style mount. I'll put the measurements up on the screen for you guys. There is a front mount option available for this guy, just like there is with the other 3 models in the lineup. It does unfortunately still require an additional adapter to front mount it, which is probably one of my main gripes about this lineup. I just don't understand why they got rid of holes on the front to make front mounting nice and easy like it was on their previous Alpha lineup. But yeah, same NRG/D1 style quick release that we see on all the other Simagic products. That supports USB pass-through. Now, as I understand it, the majority of their wheels at this point in time are still connecting through some sort of proprietary Bluetooth protocol, but they do also support standard USB protocol pass-through through the nose of the wheelbase through the slip ring mechanism. And I believe they also support CAN bus through their quick release as well. So that means that you do have the option of USB pass-through to run third-party wheels directly through their QRA. Now, I have shown you guys this before, but I do want to just quickly highlight it in this video as well, because this is a really important part of their ecosystem. We will talk about the ecosystem in a bit more detail in just a moment, but this is their QRA. So it gives you the D1/NRG style quick release on this side, so that plugs directly into the front of the wheelbase. And then you've got a standard 70mm and 50.8mm bolt pattern on the front here. So you can bolt pretty much any steering wheel that you like directly to the hub here. And then you've got a little USB-A port on the bottom here, and they include a little USB-A to C pigtail too. So you can either plug the standard cable that comes with your third-party steering wheel directly into the USB port on the QRA, and it will just fire up and work as if it was connected directly to your PC, or you can use a little pigtail to connect internally if your steering wheel supports that. And that will just keep things nice and tidy. Now, I'm really impressed by this because, as you can see, it is nice and high quality. It's all aluminium construction here, but they're only charging $89 for these guys. So for something that actually gives you USB pass-through, I think that that's a pretty good deal. Obviously, there are other options available if you're not interested in the USB pass-through. You can just directly mount any D1/NRG style quick release directly onto this. Other third parties like Moza and PXN, for example, to name a few, do use this same style quick release. Now, you will need to just be careful, of course, if you're using their wheels. While they will plug in directly, the pinouts are completely different. So you do risk causing electrical damage if you try to use one of their wheels on a Simagic base, but it will physically mount. The only thing to be aware of with the QRA is that a year ago when we reviewed the EVO lineup, we did have a couple of issues when we were testing this with some of the more high-end wheels that include a screen, like the Asher Racing McLaren Artura wheel, for example. And you can see I've got a QRA connected to this guy right now using that little short USB pigtail like I was talking about before. So you can see how clean that is as a final installation. But yeah, back when we tested the QRA a little bit over a year ago now, we did have some issues with compatibility and dropouts, things like that. And Simagic did tell us at the time that that was something that they were working on and hoping to improve. And I was kind of skeptical about that because I figured that it was probably a hardware limitation. And as it stands at the time of filming this, those same issues do unfortunately still exist. So we tried it with the McLaren Artura wheel that I just showed you guys, as well as the GSI Formula Pro Elite V2 wheel. Now, both of those wheels are, very high-end, very power-thirsty, but we did have stability issues with both of those wheels. Anything that doesn't have a screen seems to be absolutely fine. Even a lot of wheels that do have screens seem to be fine. But unfortunately, I can't give you a list of every single wheel that works and doesn't work because I can't test every single product. But what I can tell you is that there is a current limitation. So this ecosystem is only able to supply up to 1.5 amps through the internal quick release system. So if you've got a wheel that draws more than that, you are likely to run into issues, and there do seem to be some issues with electromagnetic interference there as well that can potentially cause dropouts. So we did experiment with things like turning the LED and the screen brightness down just to see if it would scrape by, but unfortunately we did have a lot of stability issues with some of those more high-end wheels. So yeah, just one thing to be aware of there. It is the same for all of the EVO models. But yeah, I was hoping that maybe they'd come up with a solution, but again, I did suspect that it wouldn't be the case simply because, a current limit is usually a hardware-based thing rather than a software-based thing. So just be aware of that. But yeah, $89 with full USB pass-through. That is a lot cheaper than what you see in a lot of other ecosystems, which, when you times one of these by the number of wheels that you might want to be using on your rig, assuming that you don't want to swap the quick release every time you want to swap wheels, it does add up pretty quickly. Now, just quickly on the ecosystem side of things as well, another thing that I do want to point out with regards to Simagic specifically is that they do have a very strong ecosystem these days. Now, they've got some really nice high quality shifters, handbrakes, pedals. We're actually working on our review of the P700 pedals right now, which is a more entry level set. So yeah, very keen to share observations on those with you guys. But I mean, look, for a PC based product, ecosystem isn't anywhere near as important as it is for a console-based product because you do have an abundance of choice there. You can mix and match and basically use whatever you want on PC because you aren't limited to one physical input like you are on a console. But the point here is that Simagic do have a very nice ecosystem. They've got a product for pretty much everything. And again, they're all very competitively priced and in our experience do a very good job for what they cost, very good value for money. So yeah, if you are the sort of person that values a quality ecosystem, you want to be running everything through the one cohesive software package and not having to run multiple programs for different peripherals on your rig, which is important to some people, not important to others. As I get older, I find that I value simplicity more and more, particularly in today's modern world. So yeah, just something to keep in the back of your mind. Have a look at our wider Simagic reviews, again linked down below for you guys if you're interested in seeing more of what they've got to offer in terms of their ecosystem. But I think for now, that is everything you need to know about the hardware. So let's move on now and talk about the software side of things and the driving experience. So Tom and I have spent a lot of time now driving with not only the EVO Ultra, but also the EVO Pro and a bunch of other wheelbases from other manufacturers in our back-to-back testing here. So we revisited the R25 and R21 Ultras from Moza, the new Podium DD from Fanatec, and a whole bunch of others as well. So if you're looking for a direct comparison between certain elements of the driving experience, the best way to drill into that kind of detail is going to be to visit our Direct Drive Buyer's Guide and the written review of this wheelbase. There you'll find all those kinds of comparisons in a lot of detail. But for the purpose of this video, what I want to do is give you an overall sense of what it's like to drive with the EVO Ultra and who I think this might be for, because you guys have heard me say many times before that I feel like the sweet spot in terms of overall strength sits somewhere between that sort of 10 to 14 Newton meter mark, maybe call it 16 Newton meters for a little bit of additional headroom. So given that we already have the EVO Pro, which is capable of 18 Newton meters, why would you actually be interested in stepping that up to 28 Newton meters? Now, you guys know by now, hopefully, that it isn't all just about overall strength. So let's dive in now and try and decipher all of this. Now, normally this would be the part of the video where I would take you through the software in detail. Because we've already reviewed the EVO series previously, I'm not gonna go through all that again. You can check out that video for all of those details. But what I do wanna do is bring the settings that we landed on up on the screen for you now. Now, I normally don't share my settings simply because I feel like it opens a bit of a can of worms. Not everybody's gonna agree with exactly the way I like to set up a wheelbase, and it can end up being quite confusing for people. But the thing that I want to illustrate here is how far below the overall capability of this wheelbase we are. Now, not only in terms of dynamic range here, you can see I've got my dynamic range capped at 14 Newton meters, but also in terms of things like your wheel rotation speed, for example. I've got that cranked all the way down to 35 when it's capable of going all the way up to 100. So effectively 35% there. Now, there are a couple of other filters and bits and pieces, things like force feedback detail, for example, which is set to 9. You can crank that all the way up. That's more like a multiplier or an amplification for existing detail if you're wanting to bring more of the raw detail out in a wheelbase. Generally speaking, what we try to do is just let the motor do its thing, and then we might bring some filters in over the top of that to just fine tune things to feel exactly how we want them to feel. But a big portion of our testing is always, just running the motor with its raw settings basically to get a feeling of the actual characteristics of what we're working with here. So you can see all of our mechanical damper, friction, all those settings are running at under that 20% mark, which is typically where we would run most wheelbases. But another interesting thing you'll notice here is I do have my slew rate capped. 0 is basically, just letting the motor do its thing. And then as you go higher up in this scale, you're capping it even further. So 30% doesn't mean we're running at 30% of the overall capability. It's kind of backwards here. 0 is off, and then 100% is a higher limit. Now, I know a lot of people will probably question, why do I limit my dynamic range here, not just set it to 100% and then turn down my in-game gain? What I like to do is set my dynamic range here, or my cap, to the maximum amount of force feedback that I ever want to feel under something like an extreme crash scenario, so I'm not tearing off my arms. And then I limit my in-game force feedback to take advantage of that dynamic range without clipping. So typically, if I'm setting my force feedback here to say around 14 Newton meters, which is the maximum that I ever want to feel, then I would be setting my in-game level to somewhere between about 70 and 80% gain. And that way I'm not running into clipping, but I'm also not running into scenarios where it's just so strong that it's going to tear the wheel out of my hands. So obviously, depending on how strong you are, will determine what you need here. But the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that I am, in terms of dynamic range, but also in terms of things like slew rate and wheel rotation speed, nowhere near the overall capabilities of this wheelbase. So that begs the question, okay, well, where do I sit with the EVO Pro? So with the EVO Pro, I'm actually not running that at its maximum capability either. I do also end up needing to not only tame it in terms of its overall strength and dynamic range, but also wheel rotation speed and detail as well to make it feel a little bit less lively and a little bit more realistic. So what does all that mean in terms of the actual driving experience? So the EVO Ultra is definitely one of the most lively wheelbases that I think we've ever tested here at Boosted Media. It's extremely responsive, extremely agile, and when you compare it back to back, you can really feel the difference in the motor characteristic that lighter weight shaft does make here. So overall, when you're comparing this with the EVO Pro, it does feel just slightly more reactive, a little bit sharper and a little bit more responsive, but not necessarily realistically so. And the reason I say that is because in a real car, your steering is going to be connected to a long shaft to the rack, which then goes through to the wheels. You've got the tire contact patch. You've got a lot of areas within that chain of components, which does add damping overall. And no real life car that I've ever driven, whether it's electronic steering or hydraulic steering or whatever the configuration, no power steering at all, nothing feels as sharp and responsive as what this wheelbase is capable of. So I'd say while this wheelbase does have the ability to provide extremely sharp and responsive force feedback, doesn't necessarily make it more realistic than other wheelbases that don't quite have that capability. So it feels to me like this is a wheelbase that would perform objectively superior on paper in terms of a lot of the sort of measurement metrics that you might use to, I guess, graph the performance of a wheelbase. But in realistic driving scenarios, not so much so, because you guys have heard me say many times now that you want to be driving the car, not have the car driving you. And if you go too crazy with sharpness and responsiveness, you do end up in scenarios where it just becomes overall unrealistic. So again, I do want to refer you guys across to our direct drive buyer's guide and the full written review of this wheelbase to drill into those finer details of exactly how it compares in the driving experience to other bases. But just to quickly give you a couple of examples here, comparing directly against the Moza R25 and R21 Ultra wheelbases, what we found with those wheelbases is that they had a bit of a sweet spot in their dynamic range. If you went beyond a certain level, things would just feel overly aggressive, robotic, and then if you tried to tame it down beyond a certain point, it didn't actually feel as good as something like an R12, for example. So there was a very defined sweet spot there. Whereas this and the Evo Pro, for that matter, perform a lot better objectively, I would say, throughout their entire dynamic range. So regardless of whether you want to run this at its full capability of 28 Newton meters, which I don't think anybody realistically is going to do, or if you want to run it all the way down closer to say 5 Newton meters, for example, you can do that without compromising the overall feel of the wheel, which you can't do with those Moza wheelbases, at least to the same extent. So that, I think, would probably be the most important metric for comparison here. Comparing against the Simagic 3, which we will be reviewing very soon as well, this, I would say, is equally as responsive as the Simagic 3s are, but feels a little bit less refined than those do. Now, obviously, we're talking about wheelbases that cost a lot more there, so you would expect that. But the way I would describe a Simagic 3 without revealing too much about our review is they really have done an incredible job of nailing having something that feels extremely responsive but smooth at the same time. And it almost sounds counterintuitive, but somehow they've worked some kind of magic that gives you that finesse, that detail, but still feels like it's connected to something mechanically. Whereas every other wheelbase that I've ever tested, the higher you go in terms of fidelity, the more robotic it starts to feel overall. So there's something there that they've done on the software side, I think, that just gives it that slight edge over a lot of these other products. And that, in my opinion at least, is why they cost a lot more. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that full review when that does come out as soon as we possibly can. So I would put this objectively at a similar kind of level in terms of the driving experience to something like the Acertec Invicta, for example. The V&M Extreme would be another example too. Very similar in terms of its overall characteristics. But at the same time, in terms of overall value for money here, I don't think this is as good a buy as the Evo Pro is, simply because it is so far beyond the point of diminishing return. Now, something that I want to highlight here is the fact that, we're talking about being beyond the point of diminishing return here on a wheelbase that costs under $1,000 US, which I think is pretty incredible when you think, a couple of years back, that point would have been in the multiple $1,000 range. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, then yeah, it is excellent value for money. But I just don't think that there's going to be that many people out there that wouldn't be just as happy realistically with the Evo Pro. So for that reason, while objectively it does present very good value for money, neither Tom or I think that it's worth that extra money over the Pro, because the Pro is much more in that sweet spot of value for money versus the driving experience. Now, to just drill down into the driving experience a little bit more, a couple of things that we always check for are consistency between different sim racing titles. And while Simagic have improved things greatly here, I would say it is still one area where they may be a little bit behind the likes of Simucube and Fanatec, for example, where you jump into a GT3 car in pretty much any sim and it feels you know, the general characteristics of a GT3 car feel fundamentally very similar, although obviously there are subtle nuances between different sim racing titles. So you will find that you do need to spend a bit of time fine tuning your profiles to different types of cars, different sims and so forth. But once you've got all that dialed in, you're going to be absolutely fine. So I think really the standout here for both Tom and I was the fact that regardless of where you sit personally within that spectrum of dynamic range, this is going to perform well, whereas a lot of those other wheelbases around this kind of price point do need to be tuned within a more specific area of the dynamic range to really perform at their best. And as soon as you step outside of that, things start to fall apart a little bit more. So from that perspective, yeah, they've done an excellent job here, but yeah, I would just find it hard to recommend over the Evo Pro unless you know that you need that additional headroom in terms of dynamic range. I just can't really see any other reason to spend that extra money because the Pro is going to be more than enough realistically for the majority of people, I think. And you do also need to consider as part of that the footprint of this wheelbase too. This is a very long wheelbase. You know, physically bigger does mean that you're not going to be able to get your screen as close if it is dropping in behind the wheelbase. Now, you do want to try and get your screen as low as possible so that you're not sort of, you know, peering up out of the dash, particularly if you're driving open wheelers. So, you know, that may be the difference between being able to get your screen in the optimum position and not being able to. So, you know, just another reason why bigger and more powerful doesn't necessarily mean better for you and your specific circumstances. So definitely a lot of things to consider there. I mean, what it ultimately boils down to is, you know, if this was 2 years ago and I was reviewing a wheelbase that was this capable at this kind of price point, I would be absolutely blown away. But we have such an abundance of choice now, particularly within Simagic's own range here with the Evo line, that, you know, where we sit right now is I struggle to recommend this simply because the Evo Pro is already so good and so capable. I just don't see any reason to spend the extra money on this one. So it's not a bad product, but yeah, I just struggle to see exactly who it's for. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Do you already own one of these? Are you happy with it? Have you driven with a Evo Pro as well? How did you feel about that? Are you compelled to upgrade to this? And if so, why exactly? Yeah, looking forward to continuing the discussion down in the comments below. Again, as I said before, make sure you check out our Direct Drive Buyer's Guide for a more detailed breakdown on all of the individual elements of the driving experience. But that is it for today's video. So thank you very much for watching, guys. Again, if you do want to pick this up or any other sim racing gear, head over to boostedmedia.net for all the latest comparisons, a bunch of discount codes, and of course, our affiliate links, which are an awesome way of supporting our work here at Boosted Media without it costing you an extra cent and potentially even saving yourselves a little bit of money in the process, regardless of what sim racing gear you might be after. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.